Hey folks, I got a very special insight check for you guys. Some friends and I recently formed a Drawsteel creators collective called the Manifold. It's just a loose collective of folks working together to make the best Drawsteel products that we can. This interview was made with the Manifold in mind. As a gift for the group, James agreed to discuss his early career with me and how he broke into the industry. I think the discussion led to a lot of helpful insights for people who also want to make a career out of TTRPG design. I know I certainly learned a lot. Speaking of the Manifold Creator Collective, regular viewers may have noticed the new look to these interviews and thumbnails. These templates were made by someone I met through the MCC, Mr. Matt Dollar. Matt does graphic design and professional layout. I've linked some of their work in the description. Check it out if it interests you. I'm sure I will be working with them a lot in the future. Before jumping into the interview, I also want to apologize and give a quick disclaimer. I had some audio quality issues in this one that I've never really encountered before at this level. Of course, I tried my best to fix them, but I am still learning this stuff, and the result is audio quality when James is speaking that is definitely below the standard that I want or am proud of. I almost didn't release this video at all, but James said so many insightful things in the interview, I ultimately decided it wouldn't be fair to him if I didn't, so I'm sorry. I hope you'll be patient with me. My audio is usually better than this. Alright, let's roll the interview. Alright, we are joined now by James Introcaso. James is a senior designer at MCDM and the current lead on Drawsteel. In this interview, we will be talking about his career working in the tabletop RPG space, so if I say anything else in the introduction, I'll be spoiling it. But of course, James has been on this podcast many times. I do recommend you check out those other interviews that we've done. James, welcome back.
Hey, thank you so much for having me, Astis. I love being here and love chatting with you, so this is going to be a fun time.
Yeah, I'm really excited for this one. So just to let the audience know the plan for this interview, I reached out to James a while back because me and some friends had just started a community of people that are looking to make third-party products for Drawsteel when it finally releases. And when you're doing any kind of creative work, I think it is really tough to do it solo, and we kind of wanted to band together. And so there was a lot of energy, all of us talking about making Drawsteel products, and there's always the hope, I know speaking for myself and I'm sure many others, that this goes somewhere and potentially roll this into a career for us, making products for tabletop games. And of course, you can never expect because it's a very niche field, but it just occurred to me, James, you are someone who, you were like us at one time. You wanted to break into the field of tabletop RPG design, and you did it when D&D 5th edition was just releasing, just like we're trying to do it now when Drawsteel is releasing. And I thought it would be really cool to talk to you about how you got your break, how your career started, and that might have some insights for all of us about how we could maybe do the same thing for Drawsteel.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so excited to talk about this. A big thing for me, right, is that I want Drawsteel to be something that third-party creators enjoy making stuff for, enjoy being part of a community for, because that was a big part of me getting my start, was finding friends and working with a great community of 5e creators, right? We don't have the audience that 5e has, but we have the power to empower creators and foster those folks in ways that a big company like Hasbro may not. And so one thing that we want to do is we make sure we're telling you as much as we can, we're open as much as we can, and we're giving you the tools to create really cool stuff for Drawsteel. So yeah, and part of that is also having this conversation, right, and talking about it. My hat is off to the fact that there is already a community of creators for a game that hasn't actually officially released yet, and that is amazing to me, because that's how I started. I started making stuff for 5e before the actual official release of 5e,
right.
Because there were public playtests and stuff.
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk to you about that. It's such an interesting time in history for me as well, because 5e has obviously become such a landmark edition in Dungeons & Dragons history. But, in the build-up to its release, at that time, it seemed like Wizards of the Coast and Dungeons & Dragons was still losing a lot of customers to Pathfinder, and, we just had no idea of knowing that fifth edition would become what it became. And so going back and studying your career, it's really fascinating just from a historical point of view. To see you right in the middle of that kind of epoch-changing moment, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, it was. I mean, it was such a 5e, and for a lot of different reasons, right, has really grown the hobby in a huge and wonderful way. And it's made things more accessible for creators, right? Like there probably is not an MCDM without the number of people who wanted to play Dungeons and Dragons because of the boom of 5e, leading them to come to YouTube to search how do I become a dungeon master, leading them to find Matt Colville, right? And part of that is the slower release strategy that accompanied 5e. Part of that is Stranger Things, right? Something outside that nobody really understood was going to have an impact on D&D the way it did. Critical Role, all this kind of stuff, right? And like the rise of Critical Role can sort of directly be traced to the Witch Hunter movie, which no one ever talks about, right? Which is like
I'm a big
D&D
Vin Diesel fan,
thing.
So yeah, I was there for that.
Yeah, right. And one thing that made Critical Role more popular, right, was that like it was already kind of popular, and then they put out this D and Diesel promotional video where it was like, hey, who was that dungeon master, and who were those people playing with Vin Diesel? Oh, you can see them play more D&D over, and it like that helped things. So like there's all of these different things, this confluence of events, and largely like also the rise of internet video allowing people to just see how a game that was hard to explain to people who had never experienced an RPG before. Now you could just say, here, watch this clip. That's what D&D is. And people will be like, oh, okay, yes, yeah, that thing they played at the beginning of Stranger Things. All right, I know what D&D is, right? And they can go from there.
Yeah, the landscape really has changed a lot, and it happened in the 5e era, and maybe a little bit because of 5e.
Yeah.
The transition from 4e to 5e was something I kind of missed, because at that time in my life, I was playing tabletop games, but I wasn't playing D&D. And it wasn't because I didn't want to, but it was I was in college and I was so broke. I could not afford anything. And I wanted to play D&D, but I went to the bookstore and I was looking at the 4th edition books, and they were too expensive for me, and there were so many. I remember being really intimidated by that.
Yeah.
And I didn't have my old books because me and all my brothers shared books growing up, and I just didn't get them. One of my other brothers had all of the books, and I started making my own game is what I did. I decided I want to run tabletop fantasy games. I can't afford books, so I'll just make my own books. And I made my own, and I ran it for my friends, and we played it a lot. But because of that, I was not plugged into D&D. And going back to that time period where I was thinking about all of these kind of high-minded design questions, at the same time, you were talking about all the same questions in connection to the release of this new edition. And yeah, it's been really fun for me to go back to that time period. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I forgot to thank you on behalf of me and all the people at the Manifold Creator Collective. Thank you and MCDM for taking the time to talk to us about all of these things. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me on, honestly. Thank you for having me, so I appreciate it.
So, here's what I did. I went through and I studied your career, mostly focused on the very early parts of it. So, I tried as best as I could to read and listen to everything that you created that I could get my hands on from 2014 till about mid-2016.
Oh, great.
And doing all of that, I got a perception of your career where I guess I kind of think of it as going in 3 phases, and maybe you don't think of it this way, but I think of there as being the kind of podcast phase where you were primarily blogging on your personal blog, the World Builder blog. Mm-hmm. And you were releasing podcasts, which were primarily the Roundtable podcast on the Tome Show, but you had many others.
Yes.
And then that kind of led to a freelance design career where you were mostly, you were making your own products, which you sold on the DMs Guild, but also working as a freelancer for Wizards of the Coast, and you got to work with a lot of what are now, I think of as, kind of defining products in 5th edition and also defining personalities of that era. I mean, of course, you now work with Matt Colville, but you also worked with Matt Mercer on products. You worked with Chris Perkins, I believe. Is that right?
Oh, yeah. Worked with Chris on a couple products, yeah. The first WotC official hardcover I worked with Chris was Waterdeep Dragon Heist.
Right. Okay, yeah. So that was your freelance career. And then, of course, you got hired full-time as a line developer for MCDM. So that's what I consider the third part, is your kind of full-time, no longer freelance design work for MCDM. It would be really fun to cover all of these periods of your career, but the one I'm really interested in this interview is kind of that early podcast portion and sort of the early part of your freelance work as well, because I guess that's the one that overlaps with the Manifold Creator Collective and me, because we're all in that portion of our careers if we ever end up having careers as well. And then it's also the beginning of 5e, just like we're in the beginning of this Draw Steel era. So yeah, those are mostly the parts that I'll be asking questions about.
Great.
Let's start from the beginning.
Cool.
You used to have a podcast called Gamer to Gamer, where you would do interviews like this, where you would interview other professional designers and just kind of go over their career. And you often started those questions by asking how people got into D&D.
Yeah.
And kind of want to add a little twist to it and and also ask you, how did you really get into D&D? Because there's a difference between people who, play D&D when they had spare time in the summer with their friends at school, and people that were doing what you were doing, which is you had, I believe, multiple campaigns that went level 1 to 30 in 4th edition. I mean, that is more than most people are able to play D&D. So, how'd you get into D&D, and how'd you really get into it,
Yeah, so my getting into D&D story is so prototypical. I'm the youngest of 3 children, and I had an older brother who played, and I remember sitting on our basement steps watching him and his friends play, because of course I wasn't allowed to play, but they were but if you sit over there and you're quiet, you can watch us, right? And I remember watching it, right? And I was, at the time, I want to say I was 8, 9 years old, right? And watching them and thinking oh my God, this is what I've always wanted, right? So I remember being a kid and playing Super Mario, right? And being why is Mario limited to the things that he can do in the game, right? Why can't Mario grab this turtle shell and surf on it to get to the end of the level faster, right? And it's
oh, really?
Yeah.
Fascinating. So you were wanting to design games from the very beginning of playing games. You had that kind of design.
Yeah, I think so. And that idea of why can't I do the things in this that I can do in real life, right? What is preventing me from being able to...
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Why is the game... And being 8, I didn't really understand that, there's technological limitations that prevent you from it, and, you should just be glad you're able to do what can be done right now already, right? And so, looking at that, right, I was okay, and so watching them play, but even board games had those limitations, right? And okay, why is it when I play Candyland that I'm limited to these move sets and I can't do these sorts of things, right? And so watching D&D and watching wait, this player says they want to do this, and then they get to do it, right? Their character does it. That to me just blew my mind that there was a game like that. And I also, I had a love of The Hobbit, and of all things kind of fantasy, right? I used to play knights and that sort of thing. And so I was this is amazing. This is the game that I want to play. And then one day, my brother, some of his friends didn't show up to play, and the friends who did show up wanted to play, and I got to sit in because they needed a cleric. That was a very sort of sit here, roll this die when we tell you to, that kind of thing, right? I basically did what I was told, but I did have some leeway to play around, and I was hooked from then on. And I had another friend over who also filled in a role, and he went home and told his dad, and his dad was hey, it's interesting that you guys like that. It was 2nd edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons at the time, and he said, I have this game that I played in college that's similar, and he pulled out the Fantasy Trip, which is a precursor to GURPS, made by Steve Jackson, 3D6 system.
Yeah.
And then I, 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade, we were playing that all the time, right? Every day in the summer we would play it. We would play it on weekends, at nights after school, whenever we could. Played it all the time, and basically played it until eventually 3rd edition came out in 2000. And we made some new friends because we had moved to middle school, and those middle school friends were like, "Oh, well, we play this," and then we tried that, and we were like, "This is great too." So we started playing 3rd edition, and from then on, I basically, like, some people take breaks and stuff, and certainly if I've experienced periods where it's like I'm not playing as much, but I've never stopped playing, thinking about reading books as they come out, D&D, right? Like, I've always been involved in some sort of game or putting together a game or that kind of thing, or if not D&D, another role-playing game, right? And I remember in high school is when we started, it was like, cool, well, we played the Fantasy Trip, we played a couple of different editions of D&D, what else is out there? Oh, there's a Star Wars role-playing game. We love Star Wars, let's try that, right? And we played the West End Games 2D6. I wrote in 8th grade, I did write based on the Fantasy Trip, like a hack of the Fantasy Trip with one of my friends. That was like a modern spy thing because we were very into like James Bond movies and playing Metal Gear Solid and stuff like that. So that was my first real foray into game design. Was like I hacked that game, and my friends and I, we played this spy game for a long time, like 2 years. And we were creating talents and stuff like that. I wish I still had it. It's on a hard drive of an old Macintosh computer somewhere. But yeah, it was super, super fun to be able to do that kind of stuff. So yeah, that's how we got started playing, and I love it. I've been hooked ever since. And in terms of now, my modern era of really starting to play, I lived basically in the same place my whole life. I lived in New Jersey, and eventually I got a job in Atlanta, working for Adult Swim after college. And I didn't know anybody, right? I moved to Atlanta without any friends or anything like that, and I wanted to make friends. And so I started going to local game store down there called Raven's Nest in Decatur, Georgia, right outside of Atlanta. And I made tons and tons of friends, and I didn't have any other commitments, right? Like back home in Jersey, I had other friends, I had family, but I also had like organizations I belonged to, theater. I did a ton of theater. This, I had nothing. So I was going to the game shop and playing 3 or 4 times a week. And that really, I was like, oh, this is what I've always wanted to do. And then I just kept it up from there. No matter where I moved, I always made sure that I had multiple groups and was always playing as much as I could.
So, yeah, you say this is what you always wanted to do. And that interests me. What possesses a person to have this thing that they like? It's a hobby, but they don't want it just to be a hobby. There's some things I enjoy, but there's other things that I can't explain it. It's just different, and I just, what it is, the best word for it is obsession. At least that's how it is for me. And it's a common thing now in these kind of hobbyists that become professionals field, like writing or acting, where the up-and-comers will ask a professional, what advice do you have for someone who aspires to be a tabletop RPG designer? And the professional always says, well, just don't aspire to do it, because it's such a hard path for these things. But there's always people that they can't not, right? Would you describe yourself as someone like that? Like, did you need to get into this field more than you just wanted to?
Yeah, I definitely really, and for a long time wanted to get into this field. It's funny, I have a memory of being a kid in like 5th grade and playing Legacy of Kain, right? Or it must have been more like 8th or 9th grade, honestly, now I'm thinking about it because I'm thinking about the timeline. And playing Legacy of Kain and loving that series of video games, and then trying to make a 3rd edition hack of Legacy of Kain. And sitting down and doing it, and my mom saying, like, what is it about this that you love, right? And she's never played a tabletop role-playing game at that point in her life. And I said, I just, like, I think this is what I want to do. I feel the need to make this stuff. I want to make this stuff. And her saying to me, like, well, you should keep at it because you can make a lot of money as a tabletop role-playing game designer, which is not true. But it's also, that wasn't important to me, right? Mm-hmm. Like making a living at this is hard, right? It is a difficult thing, and I feel very lucky and fortunate that I am able to do it. But it is definitely something that I've always wanted to do, and I got a ton of rejections throughout my career, especially at the very beginning. Before I podcasted and before I was blogging, I was heavy into 4th edition, right? You said I've run a bunch of campaigns from 1. I ran 2 campaigns from 1 to 30. I ran a bunch of one-shots and smaller adventures and things like that for friends. I submitted all the time to Dungeon and Dragon magazine and got one rejection after another throughout the entirety of the 4th edition era, right?
Okay, interesting.
And yeah, and that was, as far as I knew, that was the way to get your start back then, right? It was like, submit your stuff to Dungeon. That's what Chris Perkins did. That's how he got started. That's what, a bunch of other designers did. They'd be like, hey, we read your pitch, right? Sometimes they'd give you a little reason why it wasn't accepted. Sometimes you just wouldn't hear anything. Sometimes you could follow up and get an answer, right? It all was different. But yeah, I definitely got a lot of rejections before I managed to get paid for it. And it wasn't until I realized, like, oh, you have to do it for yourself first now, right? Like many careers now, what used to be like, yeah, you answer an ad in the paper or you find an open submission. Actually, the way forth now is like, you got to do it for yourself first before somebody asks you to do it for them. Is generally the way that it's worked in RPGs. Not always. Sometimes there are still open calls and submissions and things. But a lot of times it is, you got to prove you can do it, and you have to be the one to hire yourself, basically, before somebody else will hire you.
Right, yeah. I wish I could remember who it was, but I was listening to one of your Gamer to Gamer interviews with someone who was a writer at Wizards of the Coast, and you asked her, how did she get into D&D, just like I just asked you, and she didn't really answer that question. She just started saying how she got hired at Wizards of the Coast, which was she responded to an ad in the newspaper. Right. And because that was the story for her. She didn't know what D&D was. She just responded to an ad, and I think she actually started working on Magic the Gathering first. But that was so interesting to me because it's such a different world now to break into these fields.
Yeah, and that was Shelley Mazanoble who hosted Dragon Talk, and
that's who it was.
And she is now married to Bart Carroll, who works on D&D and stuff like that. So yeah, she. An incredible person and creator, and yeah, she got into D&D because she worked for it first, which is hilarious.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a different world. So your first sort of published content, as far as I know, was in December 2013 when the Tome Show, which was already a very long-running D&D podcast, published a podcast that you recorded, The Roundtable, and that became your regular outlet, which was weekly Roundtable, which were usually between 40 to an hour long interview style podcasts where you and your friends would cover the development of 5th edition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
At around the same time, I think it was like January 2014, you started your blog, and you had a very poetic first blog post. The title was "With a Bang."
Yeah.
Your career starts with a bang, the world that you were creating started with a bang because it was the World Builder blog. First of all, I'm fascinated because I'm someone who's doing something very similar to what you did. I worked for over a year on my YouTube channel before I got to the level where it seemed like you started with your podcast, where, I mean, you had regular listeners, you had very important guests. I mean, it wasn't that long, maybe just a few months from the time you started to the time that, you were interviewing Mike Merles. You had, on your second episode, you had a sponsor. To me, it felt like you just kind of teleported into midway through. You know what I mean? Did it feel that way to you?
Yeah, it did. And it's here's what was going on, right? I was super hungry for content about 5th edition D&D and the development of 5th edition. I worked in television video production, and I kept saying, like, I wish the Tome Show would cover this stuff more regularly, right? Like, they were putting out a podcast a week, and I was still like, I want more, right? And I wish that there were other news podcasts. And at the time, there wasn't that much stuff that was covering D&D. I had a D&D news alert, right, that I still have today. And at the time, it would ping maybe once a month. Now it pings like 30, 40 times a day, right?
Yeah.
And so it is so different, right? And it was even then the content that was coming out in podcast. There weren't that many podcasts, period, yet at that point compared to what there is now. But there were not a ton of D&D podcasts, including actual plays, including there was a handful of things. And so I remember talking about it and saying to my wife, like, I just wish somebody was talking about this stuff more, and that there was more to talk about and to cover. And she said, like, well, you know how to record audio files, right? Like, you know how to edit audio, why don't you try to do it, right? And I was like, oh yeah, that's a good idea, right? And so I got some friends together, Rudy Basso, who is going to be a seminal figure in this talk. I'm sure he and I did many podcast endeavors together. Was one of the first people on the round table. And, I got some friends together, and I was like, okay, we'll talk about this. Let's record an episode. But first, I'm going to write to this guy, Jeff Greiner, who owns and hosts most of the stuff on the Tome Show, for his advice. He's got an email, like, let me just reach out, see what he has to say. And I said, like, this is what I want to do, this blah, blah, blah. And he said, hey, that sounds really interesting. I don't know this person at all, right? Would you like to come and do it here on this network? And I thought, wow, a network that already has a built-in audience and sponsors and stuff like that? Yes, absolutely. And he said, like, record an episode, send me the first one, and we'll go from there, right? And one reason I had actually reached out to Jeff was I first reached out to a guy named Mike Shea, who goes by Sly Flourish online, right?
Yes. I mean, he's a legend, especially in the 4E era, if I'm remembering correctly. Of course, he's still very active now, but it's my vague memory of those times was that he was a big celebrity.
Yeah, he was. And he was writing for Dungeon and Dragon magazine, and he was putting out his own stuff, and he was on the Tome Show a bunch, right? Like, he was a guest that would be on the Tome Show a lot. So I reached out to him first, actually, and said, do you have advice? And his advice to me was, don't do a podcast. He was like, I don't know that that's a good idea. I think it's maybe a dying medium. And he and I are friends now, and we laugh about that a lot, because it's like, well, that's it actually so worked out. But he said, but if you're really insistent on doing it, email this guy, Jeff Greiner. So Jeff made this offer, right, and said, send me the first episode. I sent it to him. He said, hey, you know what, like, this is good enough for me to put on, but, like, maybe check your audio quality a little bit. I hear some hums. Here's some things that I would recommend that you could tighten up. Let's do another episode. Here's your sponsor. And Jeff, very generously, then I became part of the Tome Show Network, and I was like, hey, what if I did a show like this? And he was like, yeah, if you record it, we'll put it on, that's Gamer to Gamer. Hey, do this. Hey, do that. And so when that happened, right, I said, okay, you've got an opportunity here. You're going into a place with a built-in audience, right? And at the end of the Tome Show, they would always do plugs, right? Hey, follow me on Twitter. Hey, I've got a blog. Hey, I've got another podcast over here that you can check out, right, with the guests. And I thought, oh, I should have something. If you've always actually wanted to write stuff too, this is your chance to direct people to a thing where you write stuff. So you should start a blog, and you should start writing about stuff. What should it be about? Well, 5th edition is coming out. You're going to create a world for your friends to play in. Make it about that. Make it about your journey creating stuff for this world and for 5th edition. And that's how World Builder blog got started. I was like, I desperately want to push people to something. And my wife, who at the time was my girlfriend, when all of this started, she was away on a business trip that lasted like 3 weeks. And so I was like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to write as many blog posts as I can. To get started, fill the blog up with content, and then when people go, they'll see that there is stuff there. For a long time, I was updating the blog twice a week. I was doing the roundtable weekly and editing it, and I was also doing stuff like Gamer to Gamer and guesting on podcasts and stuff like that. And it became, it was through Jeff and through the Tome Show that Jeff would be like, hey, because he had been doing it for years at that point. Hey, I'm going to go to Gen Con and I'm going to interview these people. Would you like to also interview them? Yes, absolutely. Hey, I'm going to go to Gen Con and I can introduce you to Shelley Mazanoble, to Mike Merles, to Chris Perkins, right? These are all people who knew his name. And I was like, oh my gosh. But it turns out the industry is really small. And especially at that point, it was even smaller than it is now, right? Like Polygon wasn't interested in covering anything D&D was doing at the time. You know, IGN and GameStop, all those places, like, they were interested in video games, not tabletop, and especially not tabletop role-playing. I was in the right place at the right time for all of that stuff, right, to meet those people and to get my foot in the door and to start doing that. And I would say... that was, I think you said that was December 2013, right? Was when that stuff sort of started.
It aired, I think, December 23rd, 2013 was your first roundtable. Yeah.
And probably between that and blogging, right? For a long time, I was just doing that. It was a long time before I actually started to make money doing it. And like the sponsors, right? The sponsors for the Tome Show, Noble Knight Games, great place, by the way. They were doing things like paying for hosting fees, right? Like Jeff Greiner wasn't pocketing money. I wasn't pocketing money. It was like, we need to pay for a website and this basically covers it and that's it, right? Like, so it was a lot of passion-driven stuff that was going on for those first year and a half to 2 years, and like getting it in there and working. And there were times where I was like, oh, I don't want to have to edit a podcast episode right now, but I also know that if you put out an episode each week, that's really how you build an audience, so I better do it, right? Like I was my own boss when it came to keeping deadlines. And the dedication was like I really want to do this. And the only way to do that I know how is to brute force it and to force myself to edit this. I always love talking about it, obviously, as you can tell by the fact that my voice keeps yakking on here. But, you know, it was stuff like, oh, man, do I want to edit this? Do I want to write another blog post? Do I want to, you know, there's other stuff that I could be doing right now. I was like, no. Get it done now, because this is the time in your life, right? I was in my 20s, I didn't have kids, all that kind of stuff, and I was able to make it happen and really do it. And I was also lucky. I was lucky because I started in a time where there weren't, you know, like you said, D&D was sort of in decline, and so it was a smaller landscape of creators and stuff like that. I'm sure we'll get into some of my first DM's Guild products and how if I put those out today, no one would ever even notice that they were there. So.
Yeah, it is funny. You hear a lot when you listen to interviews like this, that when people get their start, it's always a combination of luck and work. But you must have really been hustling. That's one of the first things that I noticed. I mean, so the Roundtable was a weekly podcast. And I assume you did all of it yourself. You said you edited it yourself. Did you book your own guests?
Yes. Yeah, I booked the guests. You know, I would record the audio during the thing. And yeah, so that's how we would work that out, right? It would be like, okay, this is when we're going to meet. This is when we're going to do this. Start to get things ready. Now, what happens is, once you got a little bit of like, hey, this is happening, sometimes people would email you and be like, hey, can I come on the roundtable? I would like to talk about stuff. Right?
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's fun.
Yeah, that was great. It was always great to get an email like that. I remember before we went to Gen Con for the first time, Rudy and I got an email from WotC PR, because Jeff had directed them to us, right? That was like, would you like to meet with some of the designers for D&D? And Rudy and I were like, oh my gosh, it's happening, right? Like, this is it. Yeah, so that was very cool when stuff like that started to happen, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, a weekly podcast where you're choosing the topics, you're booking the guests, you're recording it, and you're editing it that's a lot of work. And it wasn't just that podcast. You were also regularly a guest on other podcasts. You had... once 5th edition released, you had the bonus action podcast, which was just small little snippets where you would explain some of the rules of 5th edition. You did Gamers to Gamers. And then I think you were updating your blog. Was it twice a week you would release articles?
Yeah. Tuesdays and Thursdays, I would put out something. Yeah.
I mean, that's way more than I'm doing. That must have been a ton of work on top of a full-time job as well. I mean, yes. That's insane. You must have been working all the time.
I really was working all the time. And I was a writer, producer of promos at National Geographic, right? So, you know, coming up next, we could tune it, blah, 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 right? Like, I would write those scripts and I would work with an editor to cut together those spots and that sort of thing. And that was wildly fun to be able to do. But yeah, it did mean that, like, there was a lot of times where I was writing. I took public transportation to work every day, and I would write blog posts while I was on public transportation, right? To be like, okay, I'm going to try to do this and get this done. And then podcast editing, I would just make sure that I set aside time. The thing that I learned about editing a conversation like this, right, is generally if everything goes well, right, and you probably know this better than I do, it takes 2 to 3 times the length of the conversation to edit the podcast now.
To edit, just specifically to edit.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Yeah, I guess I haven't thought about it like that. But editing is the big block. Especially for me, I find that a lot of like the psychological barriers come in with editing as well, because having a conversation like this, super fun. But if you're someone like me, I find it very... the biggest psychological barrier is a kind of like self-consciousness when it comes to listening to my own stuff. Like I cannot listen to my own videos. I just can't do it. Like it makes me cringe inside for some reason, even after years of doing it. So having to spend hours and hours listening and re-listening and specifically listening to all your mistakes, I find it really difficult.
Oh, yeah.
But that's probably too much of a glimpse into my inner life than you were expecting. But all of that's to say is you're absolutely right. A lot of people overlook editing. It's a lot of work.
Yeah, well, and I couldn't agree more, right? There's an extra factor to editing yourself that makes it more difficult, because there's also a desire to, and I've talked with Rudy about this a lot, when you're editing yourself, you work like other people, because we often judge ourselves harsher than other people, right? The work you put into editing yourself is often greater than the work you put into editing the guest, because you're like, well, the guest sounds super smart. I sound like an idiot. And so I need to do a lot of work to make myself sound good. And it's like the guest has just as many pauses and uhs and ums and starts over. But that sounds natural to you and you're fine with it, as opposed to when you're judging yourself. Yeah, absolutely. 100%.
One thing that surprised me, I guess, when I dug into the round table is, I guess I kind of expected, because now you're very much... what's the right word for this? I guess it's you're the opinions guy is the phrase that comes to mind, right? You stream on Twitch where people ask you questions, and you have a whole lot of people that are wanting your opinion. You know, I have you on my shows because I want to hear your opinion on things, but on the round table, you were very much a facilitator of other people's opinions. And so much of your work, it seemed to me, was... you were the host. You were not really offering your own perspective as much. So what are your thoughts on that? Why is it that you started as very much a facilitator of other people's opinions, when all of this time you had what would become what I consider one of the greats in the field right now, one of the S-tier designers? You had all of that in you, but you weren't really talking about it.
Well, I think some of that was, I had to develop a sense of design and why things were the way they were, and some of that was inherent, right, from playing lots of games and from, I had opinions about narrative and stuff from being a writer, and but I think some of that too was like, okay, I'm going to listen to other people talk. And when it came to the round table, there was a big reason for me taking on mostly the facilitator role, and that was that there were generally 4 people besides me who were in the chat. And if you listen to the way questions are answered there, a lot of what will happen is by the time we get to the last person, they struggle with what to answer, because they're like, the 3 of you. And it's also why we stagger. I would stagger who would answer, right? It would be like, okay, if you were the last person to answer the last question, I'm going to make sure that you're the first or second person to answer it, right? Like, try to keep things going that way. And what I realized was like, well, we're already hearing so many opinions, and for the sake of the show, unless I have something else to add, something interesting, I was going to keep quiet, right, and say like, cool, these people are already expressing sort of my ideas and my opinions. When it came to interviewing bigger designers, right, I would be like, well, they sort of know better than me, right? Like that's how I felt at the time, was like, well, they've been doing it a long time, I should learn, right? Like I should sit back and I should learn. Once I start really designing my own stuff, right? And there's a point at which I broke away from the Tome Show and started our own podcast network, Rudy and I, the Don't Split the Podcast Network, which is now also defunct. We did indeed split the podcast network. But I had a show called Tabletop Babble, and that's because I wanted to cover stuff other than just D&D. I wanted to talk about more things, and the Tome Show was very D&D focused. I love everyone at the Tome Show still. It's great, and they're good folks. And I definitely get more and more opinionated as you listen to these things, because I get more confident, right? And part of that was blogging, right? Doing the blog taught me like, oh, there are some things that you've always assumed that are true that are not. And there are some things that you've always assumed that are true that are, and you were right. And those sorts of things I think were really fun to see. And I also became doing the Tome Show and doing the blog, right? And this was like key to my success. It made me a more active member of the community, of the RPG community. And that is huge. The fact that you have a collective is great. Because like the one thing that I started doing when I was blogging was I started to look at and read other blogs, right? And there's this thing, I believe it still happens actually. And now I'm going to Google it here while I'm talking to you. But there was this thing called the RPG Blog Carnival, right?
Yeah. You participated in it quite a bit.
I did. And it definitely helped me. So the RPG Blog Carnival was, yeah, and in fact, it is still going on. Of Dice and Dragons is now like the Blog Carnival person. And the Blog Carnival is this, right? One blog a month picks a topic, right, of all the RPG blogs. And basically, you can go in, you can email the person who is running it. Right now, it's Of Dice and Dragons blog, right? You email them and say, like, hey, here's the theme that I want to do. The theme could be anything from, like, advice for people running games. Star Wars was a theme when I did it once. Hey, mysteries is the theme, right? Whatever it is. And then you say, what I am going to do is people will link to my blog when they write their entry. And then at the end of the month, I will collect all the entries into one blog post and write about like, hey, this month the theme was this. And hey, if you want to read about, it was Star Wars. If you want to read about using force powers in 5e, go over here to this blog. If you want to read about the themes of Star Wars working in a urban fantasy cyberpunk setting, go over here to this blog, right? And so it was a way for blogs to cross-pollinate with each other. And that really helped because then I started to read other people's blogs and they started to read mine. And we would give each other, we would solicit feedback and like with an open mind be like, hey, what do you actually think about this? And ready to receive that criticism. And also ready to offer your own, and this is key, when you're asked, right? When someone asks for it, being like, okay, right? And like any community, you should be giving better than you're getting, and the community will give back to you 20-fold, right? Like the fact that like you would be out there, because then I would see stuff and I'd be like, hey, this is just really cool and people should know about this, so I'm going to share it on my socials. I'm going to shout it out on the podcast. I'm going to talk about it on my blog, right? And then people would do the same for you because they would come check out your stuff and be like, hey, this guy shouted me out. Why did he do? Oh, you know what? This is really cool. And he's got this thing and I'm going to talk about that, right? And that sort of give and take exchange in the early days was hugely, hugely important. And it's one thing I did not realize, right? When I started the roundtable, it was just because I wanted to talk with people about D&D. I didn't realize it would mean like talking to other creators who then would also share the podcast on their socials and stuff, and it would help the podcast grow and that sort of thing. So yeah, that's I forget what your initial question was, but yeah, that being part of that community was very important.
Let's transition to talking about the World Builder blog since we're already talking about it.
Sure, yeah.
I really enjoyed reading through all of your article. Well, not all of them, but I read through many of them. I have some questions about it, but first I encountered somewhere around like 2015 or something, in one of your articles you left a note to yourself and I thought I could pass it on because I don't know if you're so here's a note James left for future James. It just says, note to self, idea for future D&D retirement community. Maybe draw steel retirement community in the future. You should talk to Matt about that.
So it's I have actually talked about this, and it is still a dream of mine. So there's lots of gamers right now who have reached retirement age, and there will only continue to be more as gaming grows as a hobby, right? And the idea that there would be retirement communities that are focused on getting the people who live in them together to play games, I think is amazing, right? And it seems like a surefire way to make money, but also it's something that I want to exist for myself, right? And so like I don't know anything about real estate, starting a retirement community, anything like that, but if someone does and someone makes one, let me know. Not only am I interested in investing, I'm interested in reserving my spot. Yeah, I would love to do it. So Aestus, if you have any knowledge of this kind of stuff, let's be on board.
I'll put the feelers out in the collective, see if anyone's got any connections.
Exactly.
So when I was reading your articles, another thing that surprised me So the World Builder blog was a blog. You blog through building a world, and I guess the again I suppose just a misconception of someone who's followed you mostly since MCDM. Looking back, I had this impression that your blog would be, it would include a lot of I guess we could call crunch, a lot of rules and rules design, because I see that today is very much your strength, as you're someone who has really studied TTRPG design,
Yeah.
and you've thought about a lot. And while you have many skills, you are the peak when it comes to rules design. But the World Builder blog was a much more narrative design focused thing.
Yes.
So yeah, I'm wondering how that shift happened for you.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's funny, especially in the early days, I felt more comfortable writing a lot of story-focused stuff because I was like, well, I've made stuff for my games, but I don't know how to present it, and I don't know how to... and it was very slow going, and the things that I would make, it would be, even when I made something mechanical, it was always like starting with the story first, right? And so, yeah, I think one of my first articles on there, and I'm sort of embarrassed by this, is like, how do I name things? And it is not at all like a scientific or interesting article. It's like very much like, then I make up medieval sounding words, and like it's not,
Right.
And so when I look at that stuff, I'm like, oh, this is so, yeah, it's cringy or whatever, but it's also fascinating from an early design perspective that I'm like, okay, this is what you felt comfortable writing, right? And now I am very comfortable writing and talking about game mechanics, and some of that started when I was making stuff for 5e, because I remember like reading the basic rules when they came out and being like, oh, hang on, you can make a background. The formula for a background is right here, and you're a genius because you've broken that formula. Right now, obviously, I wasn't a genius. Any gamer can look at a 5e background and be like, okay, I get it. You get these skills, you get tool and language proficiencies, and then you get this other feature, right? Especially in the 2014 rules, right? But at the time, I felt like, oh, yeah, you know what this is. You feel safe doing it. And so I started doing like lots of backgrounds because I also felt like backgrounds were missing something in 5e, which was the fantastic element. Like there were no backgrounds for like, what if I was cursed in my background? And that was more defining to me than the fact that I was, a thief, right? Or a sage, right? What if I was, polymorphed, right? I used to be this, and now I'm this, right? Like, and so it was very slowly dipping my toe into things like that, because once I got comfortable, and I think I made a bunch of backgrounds, right? Then I was like, you could probably make magic items, right? It's hard to make a magic item that's not balanced, because all you need to do is get the rarity right? Like, and anything else, it's kind of anything goes with magic items. So you could do that, right? And then it was like, you know what? I'm looking at these monsters, and I think this was before the Dungeon Master's Guide came out that like revealed the math of monsters, kind of, right? Now, obviously, in the 2014 Dungeon Master's Guide, also not perfect. It's sort of quick and dirty monster building, not here's how it actually is, as we all know. But I was like, oh, I backwards engineered how proficiency bonuses work. And again, not revolutionary, but for me, I was like, okay, it was building my confidence with that stuff as I was getting into it. And so it was a slow thing.
Right.
And so it was that, but then the podcasts are really something that helped me out, because I started to talk to people. It was like every week, especially when I was doing things like Gamer to Gamer and having people like Rob Schwalb on, it was like getting a master class in game design, right? That I was like, oh my God, I'm listening to Rob Schwalb talk about why he designed Shadow of the Demon Lord the way he did. And I think I agree with a lot of this stuff. It makes sense to me why you would do this, right? And so particularly entering that stuff with the attitude of like, this person knows better than me because they're more experienced, I think helped me open my own mind, right? And be like, okay, now I'm gaining confidence as I write about this stuff. I would say that I don't think World Builder blog ever really, because I sort of stopped. I did a lot of stuff for World Builder blog, and I would still do creations and things. And, I started to blog about like what I was working on the DMs Guild, but I never really got it too into game design philosophy on there. But I did start talking about it more in podcasts. And I did, once I got to MCDM, I felt like, Matt talks about it all the time, and I felt like, okay, I really can let my wings spread here and talk a lot about it. And the place where I talked about it the most before then was actually Twitter, right? Like I would have all kinds of hot takes on Twitter about stuff.
Yeah, that is actually, I didn't dive into your Twitter as much, just because I'm always intimidated by doing Twitter research. It feels like there's so much there that I'll just get swamped. But,
Yeah.
That makes sense. What you're describing, where you were learning from people on your show, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I felt like I got to see one of those in real time. It was on Roundtable episode 78, which is, to me at least, was a really fun episode for posterity, because I think it was the first episode where you had on James Haeck.
Oh, yeah.
Who, my understanding is, he became a friend of yours. Didn't he introduce you to MCDM?
Yeah. So James Haeck, and I believe James now uses they/them pronouns.
Of course. I'm so sorry. Yeah, that's
just
slipped my mind.
Yeah, totally. Well, and at the time, right, if you're listening to that podcast, we're using a different set of pronouns for James then. So here's the thing that's fascinating about James, right? My first paid job in role-playing games was I submitted for Insider Magazine, a magazine delivered through Patreon by EN World, right? And it was for 5e. They were doing it before there was an OGL and license for 5e, right? They were just assuming like we could be okay. We think we can get away with this, and we're going to base it off the 3rd edition OGL. I used to go promote my blog, right, on N-World and stuff, and I would read N-World. And when I read like, oh, they're putting out this magazine, I was like, okay, let's submit something. Like, what do you think? Well, I think the chase rules in the DMG could use some better explanation and stuff, and so I'm gonna submit an article about that. About like running chases and enhancing your chases. And the editor was this person named James Haeck at the time. And the thing that was cool about them was like they wrote back to me and they were a great collaborator. And it was the first time I'd ever worked with anybody in this capacity. And they were like, what if we did this? What if, we should add some custom chase tables for some new environments. Yeah, that's cool. Let's do this. Right. And like we worked back and forth and it was great fun. And then I submitted a couple more times to do more things. And then I had them on my show. And I learned that they were 10 years younger than I was. And they were still in college at the time. Right. And I was like, oh, my gosh, you're like a prodigy here.
They were.
And indeed,
they were also an excellent guest. I mean, just from the very beginning, they had a charisma, I think. So, yeah.
Yeah, they really did, and that is here's the thing, that's who they are in real life, right? Like I've hung out with them many times. That's the real deal is what you're getting on podcasts and stuff from them. They love game design, they love games, and they're very enthusiastic about it. And so we became friends. We continued to work on a lot of stuff, and the first Wizards of the Coast book that I worked on, Dragon Heist, right? They brought me in and they said, we've hired another freelancer who you're going to work with, and the two of you will meet with Chris Perkins every week, like in a half-hour call to like answer questions and stuff. And I was like, oh, that's great. Who is it? And it was James Haeck. And so our careers in many ways have, we're both named James. Have been like linked to each other. And then like, James got me the job, recommended me to Matt Mercer to work on Explorer's Guide to Wildemount, right? And so we've recommended each other for a bunch of different jobs. James actually worked with MCDM before I did, right, on Strongholds and Followers. They wrote the adventure for that. So like, we are very linked and also often confused with one another, which is good fun too. Like it's a compliment to me. It is an insult to them for us to be confused with each other. But yeah, it's great.
So beside that, in this episode, Roundtable 78, it's also when the first Noble Knight ad aired where you sang an ad for Noble Knight. So that's... people can go back and listen to that. It was good.
I forgot about that.
The really interesting part of this interview is after interviewing James Haeck, you interviewed Susan J. Morris, who had created a kid's version of D&D, is what, if I'm remembering that right?
Yes.
And she is also a writer, and you were having a very interesting talk with her. And at one point, she was talking about the process of designing rules so that people, if they did not have a die 20, they could use die 6s to simulate the die 20. Because everyone has, Monopoly or Candyland, so they have die 6s for that. While she was explaining that, you sounded very impressed in the interview that she was able to do this kind of probability math, which shocked me because I consider that as really kind of the fundamentals of game design is dice probability math, right? And and I could see you kind of learning as she described the process. You were learning what I now consider a very basic thing. Yeah, so that's just an example I think of, is you were able to use this podcast to create a course for yourself on how to design tabletop games.
Yeah, and that is 100% it, right? Like, and I'm sure there's stuff that I have listened back to and I've been like, wow, you should have known that already, right? And that's and it's funny, I would also put out those podcasts and people would say like, I can't believe this guy doesn't understand this already, right? And stuff like that. And it's like, oh yeah, fair enough. But Susan J. Morris is an incredible author and editor and really, really great. Worked at WotC developing novels and did Heroes of Hesiod, that game for kids. Yeah, she was also just great to talk to. But yeah, I think about that all the time, about like, there were things that I just learned because it was like, yeah, I just never, even playing games, I just never really thought about it. And then I'd be like, okay, well, now I'm going to take this over to my blog because now I understand dice probability a little bit better. And so I think I now have the confidence to try things and try to make things work because I think they would be cool or interesting, right? And yeah, that has been... it's been a delight. And it really was a delightful way to learn because it was basically like... there weren't a lot of RPG courses you could take to learn stuff. So it was just sitting down, talking to people. And I think a thing that really helped me was being open and honest about what I did and didn't know, right? I spent a long time when I was a kid and like in high school and stuff, pretending like I knew everything. Right. And the first job I got into, I tried to do that. And people would be like, how do you know that? You shouldn't know that already. And then I'd have to be like, oh, I didn't. And so I just decided, like, you know what? When you don't know something, be honest about it and just say, I don't know, act enthusiastic and that kind of thing. And that has really helped. That has really, really helped because you know what nerds love doing? They love explaining stuff to people. And so if you say you don't know, then you're going to get an explanation. They're never going to make fun of you, right? Which was always my worry, that I was going to be made fun of or whatever. And sometimes they do, but whatever, that's fine. Most of the time you're going to find somebody who's willing to explain and teach you, and learning is awesome.
Yeah, my YouTube first got its break because I started doing very, very detailed spreadsheets analyzing the math of the games that I was covering.
That's awesome.
And I don't do that as much anymore, but I learned that skill set from my wife, actually, because she's a scientist. She does, she's a PhD and does research. So she works with data a lot and uses Excel a lot. And one day, I always felt like my inability to use Excel was what was holding me back in design. And she just gave me a really quick crash course, and that became sort of the first marketable skill that I had that allowed me to get a foot in YouTube.
Oh, wow.
So, that's such a great piece of advice. I guess I'm just echoing it as well. Just find people who are nerds and ask them about what they do.
Absolutely.
And learn about it. It's a life hack for you.
That is great advice.
Well, I wanted to talk to you about some of the monsters in particular that you released on World Builder blog, but I'm worried that we're running out of time. So let's skip ahead a little bit to talk about your first products on the DM's Guild, because it's really cool, actually, going back and listening to the emergency roundtable podcast that you recorded whenever Wizards of the Coast announced the DM's Guild, because this was such a huge deal. Every guest on your channel was talking about the possibilities, and every single one of them mentioned how excited they were for you, that you were going to have an opportunity to publish your blog stuff on the DM's Guild. And of course, you did, and they almost instantly became silver bestsellers. So can you tell us about that time of your life?
Yeah. So I remember, right, like it was a long, like, are they going to put out something? Right? Like when, and they keep saying they're going to, but they keep saying there's like a murder trial involved, and they're one of their lawyers being on the jury, so they can't make the OGL happen, and like, and so 2014, the Player's Handbook comes out, summer of 2014. January 2016, a year and a half later, it's when the OGL comes out, and at the same time they announce the DMs Guild. And the DMs Guild was unexpected, right? That wasn't something that people thought was going to happen. And the DMs Guild was, hey, here's an easier way to publish. It's a chance to get your IP out there. And key for me was, this is where Wizards of the Coast is going to look if they are going to try to find writers, right? Like, they're going to look at these products. Now, they also looked in other places, right? But they did look at the DMs Guild. And so I thought, okay, I've got all this stuff on my blog. I've got these monsters, these backgrounds. I've got adventures. I've got all this stuff, right? Right now, there's nothing on this marketplace. This marketplace that is being highly publicized, right? That people are talking about, that I'm talking about all the time. Should I got to put stuff on there. Oh my God, I've got stuff on my blog. I can just take the monsters and stuff I have on there and put them into PDFs, and maybe I'll make them pay what you want because they were on my blog and they were available for free, right? So I want to make sure that people who needed access to them still had access to them, right? That it wasn't like, hey, I was going to use this and now you took it off because it's on the DMs Guild, right? And it can only be on the DMs Guild if it's up there, and now I can't, right? Like, I wanted, like, no, I need you to be able to access that still. So I did that, and I was like, I think I know how to turn a Word doc into a PDF, and I used the template that they provided, and that's what I did. And it is very obviously a Word doc with clip art, just like copy and paste it in there, turned into a thing, right? It would never ace this today, blink on the top. It would never blink the top, 10,000. But at the time, there wasn't that much on there. And I had a little bit of a name going for me at this point because I had been blogging for a while. And I was able to seize the day and take advantage of that. And people seem to think the stuff was fairly well designed. Now, I look at it now and I'm like, oh God, this is awful, right? And it's typo written. Like, I didn't have an editor, right? Like, I just did it myself and put it up there, and I would proofread it. But now, like, there's I think, like, traps, right? I put a collection of traps up there.
Yeah, that was one of your better selling ones.
Yeah, and it's because of what do people need, right? They need stuff to drop into their games, and traps is one of the big things where it's like, I want to put in traps so I don't want to have to do the work of designing them. So, hey, here you go. Yeah, so I did a bunch of those things, and, right, like, I was able to just promote that stuff, and kind of everything on the DMs Guild looked like that at that time, right? So we weren't getting stuff like we're getting now, right? And that was very quick. Within a year, people were putting things that they had bought custom art for. They were putting things that had, they had worked with editors. Keith Baker was starting to put up stuff for Eberron, right? Like, it was like, once Eberron was up there, right, Keith Baker had stuff, like, ready to go, basically. So yeah, I was able to strike kind of while the iron was hot and do stuff. And that led me to getting a shot at writing an Adventurers League adventure. And so I wrote an Adventurers League adventure that was tied into Storm King's Thunder called A Dish Best Served Cold. That looks a little bit better. It's still a Word document turned into a PDF, but the template they have for that is much nicer. They got someone to actually draw the maps for it, right, and that sort of thing. And then Chris Perkins DM'd me in Twitter and said, hey, James, your name has come up as somebody who might like to freelance here. I still don't know how exactly he found me. I asked him, and he couldn't remember. Can you send me a sample of something you're really proud of? So I sent him A Dish Best Served Cold because that had been professionally edited, right? And it had been play tested and stuff. So I was like, well, I feel like this is probably my best bet. And then, like, a month went by and I didn't hear anything. And I thought, like, oh, well, it was nice to have the shot. And, I guess Chris didn't like it. And and at that point, right?
Oh,
I was
really?
like,
interesting.
This was like February 2017, I think. Maybe 2016. Now I'm trying to remember. But I remember thinking, like, I am exhausted. I'm exhausted from blogging. I'm exhausting from podcasting. I've been putting in all this work. A lot of it has been for free and for me, and maybe I should cut back a little bit and focus on other things. And then I got, like, that same day, got the email from Chris that was like, hey, James, I'd like to hire you to work on a project that's going to be called, that would eventually be Waterdeep Dragon Heist. So yeah, that was a big thing. Was getting that stuff out was a hustle because I was still doing the podcast and the blog and stuff, and I was like, God, I got to get these products up now too, and that took forever. Now, if I was going to turn a Word doc into a PDF, I could do it in about a half hour. But back then, it took me a long time.
Yeah, I'd say it's quite a coincidence that the day that you're thinking of giving it all up is the day you get that call. But sometimes I think every day is the day you think of giving. I don't know if it's like that for you, but for me, I think every day, this is the day I quit because
Yes.
it's so much work and sometimes it feels like you don't go anywhere. But
Yeah, no, absolutely. It absolutely feels that way, and I think it's easy to feel that way on any given day, especially because like I was having this conversation with our art director yesterday where it was like often he and I are the same in this, like when you get done a project, you then feel like, okay, what's next? And you don't think about like, wow, look at this thing we just accomplished, right? Like it's like, whew, I got that episode out. Oh, well, the clock's ticking. Time to get the next one.
For me, I've already started on the next thing when I finish a product.
Exactly.
So when I finish a product, I'm like, finally, that's done, and now I can focus more on the next thing.
Yeah, exactly. And start the one after that, right? Like it's at what point do we get to be happy, right? And I think it is important to sit down and remind yourself, like, wait, look at all I've done. This has been great. I forgot I did most of these things that we're talking about. I'm like, oh yeah, okay, I have a lot to be proud of. Thank you for reminding me, Estes.
Yeah, this is a sidetrack we probably don't have time to go into, but I just want to mention it anyways. Have you watched the movie, the Coen Brothers movie, I believe, Inside Llewyn Davis?
Oh, no, I have not.
It's a story about an artist who's trying to get his break. And it's really interesting to me because it feels like the moments of the movie when you, the viewer, connect the most with the artist and you feel like this is incredible. There are always the moments where the actual people in his life tell him he should give up. And so you get, the directors allow you to, you feel him where you're like, this guy is so good. He's just on the brink of making it, but he never breaks through. And so often I feel that way. I'm sure you probably did as well. I watch that movie a lot just so I can be not reminded because I feel it every day, just so I know that somebody else feels it too. There's this weird thing about the kind of work that, where you were back then and where it feels like I am now, where I think the difference between me wasting my time and me having the best time of my life that I'm going to look back to fondly is something that could happen in the future. It's like Schrodinger's career, where you're like, it could be a good experience or it could be a bad experience, and what determines that is just something in the future that I can't know about. Did you ever feel that way, or is it just me? We can cut this part out, but
Oh no, yeah, absolutely. It's easy to feel, much like we talked about, sort of editing your own voice, right? I think that we're our own harshest critics when it comes to our work. And we also, like, I compared myself to people all the time when I was coming up. And I would say things like, well, this person has been blogging 3 months shorter than I have. And why are they doing things differently than, they're getting more opportunities than I am, right? They're getting more to do. Hey, this person has been doing this for a long time. I'm surpassing them. I must be better, right? In some way. And the truth of that is, like, no, none of that is reality. And I always try to, when I think about that stuff, say to myself, like, what would I say if it weren't me? Like, if my wife came to me and said something like this, how would I feel? What would I say? If a friend came to me, Rudy, if Astis came to me, right, and said, like, I'm feeling this way, what should I do? And it's like, yeah, that helps ground you. And the truth is, like you said, there's a lot of luck that is involved in this. And sometimes it's all about, like, how long can you stay at and sit at the table, right?
Yeah.
And your currency is your time, your effort, and that sort of thing. Eventually, you're going to hit blackjack, right? In many cases. But for some of us, it takes a long time. It took me a long time to get to where I am. And I often think, like, am I a fraud? Like, I have imposter syndrome all day, every day, all the time, where I think about, like, God, I don't know that I can do this. Like, I did Jarl Steel. People like Jarl Steel. I don't think they actually like Jarl Steel. I am afraid that 3 years from now, people will be like, when you play Jarl Steel for 3 years, then you learn that it's actually a terrible game. And we, like those are the sorts of fears that I think I have. And I think it's natural when you talk to anybody, any creator, they have that sort of fear of being judged because they're judging their work very harshly. And that's how they make it the best it can be. So that judgment is what drives you to be your own J.K. Simmons and Whiplash, right? That's kind of what's going on. So.
Before we end, I really want to ask you about skills of game design, because At another point in my life, I played a lot of sports. And there's this entire network of creating good athletes. And there was a system that you would go through to be good at a sport. Part of the system is coaches who would harp about the fundamentals. And it's funny now trying to master game design where there really isn't a system. There's no network. It just everyone kind of does their own things. And one of the things I kind of miss, I feel like is needed is to answer this question: what are the fundamentals of game design?
Oh man, that is a really, really good question. I need to be honest when I talk about game design and say that, like, my focus, right, is very limited, right? I make a lot of tabletop role-playing games. And, you know, I've dabbled here and there with some other sort of tabletop game, but never always helping somebody who else's idea it was or that kind of thing. I just want to caveat what I say as, like,
yeah,
it doesn't necessarily apply to all because I don't have the experience, right, in all of these different branches of even tabletop game design. It's really specific to role-playing games. I think for me, the fundamental that I always start with, right, is you always want to remember what is the fantasy that you are trying to support, right? And using that as your North Star. And I think that is the biggest thing, right? For Draw Steel, when we say tactical, cinematic, heroic role-playing, right, the reason we pick those words is because those are our North Stars, right? And if we're putting in a game mechanic that isn't one of those things, we step back and we're like, whoa, what have we done? Right? We made a mistake. We need to think about, like, these are the things that we're trying to do. This is the fantasy we're trying to support. So this is the goal, and that's what we're shooting for, right?
Right.
So that would, like, for me, the one fundamental in tabletop, right, role playing games is always remember the fantasy that you are trying to support, and only do things that support that fantasy. Now, if we're talking like down and gritty fundamentals, I do think learning things like dice probability and understanding
Excel
dice
and word
probability.
processors might be really good fundamentals.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, right, exactly. So, like, understanding basic probability is really, really important. And when you think about, like, basic games, right, like casino games and stuff, the way they hook you in is through things like probability, right? You think about the roulette wheel, right? The roulette wheel, in its most basic form, you bet on a color, black, red, or green, right? And you think, if you're betting on black or red, that you have about a 50% chance. And you do have about a 50% chance, but it's a little less, right? Because of those two green numbers on there, 0 and 00. And so those things affect the probability in such a way that it means the house wins enough, but you're winning enough that you feel like you win enough that you want to keep playing, right? For tabletop game design, right, like we get into probability of things like, you know, D&D has sort of figured out, like, as long as you're hitting between 65 and 70% of the time, you're engaged enough and you want to keep playing D&D. So they math out their skills, they math out their to-hit bonuses against armor class, right, with those sorts of probabilities in mind. So understanding probability, I think, is hugely, hugely important. And then understanding how that affects the fun, right, is sort of the next fundamental.
Awesome. The final thought I kind of wanted to end with was I reflected on your career, just the parts I did kind of by studying it, and tried to kind of boil it down to a principle. What was the X factor that led to your success? I really felt like the most important factor for you, I mean, you did work hard and there was luck involved, but it really seemed like it was the people that you partnered with. I've even noticed in myself in just the few interviews that we've done together, I feel like you have this aura of friendship, or even after our first interview, I felt like, oh, this is a guy I could talk to. You know? What do you think about, am I right? Did I get the right message out of it? And do you feel like you have that effect, or is that something you developed?
You know, my brother and I, we talk about this a lot, that, like, just being a person is hard. It's work. Life is going to throw a lot of different curveballs at you, right? And just existing, just being a person is really difficult in this world, right? And the older you get, the more difficult it becomes in many ways. So for me, one thing I try to do is I try to treat everybody I meet with kindness, as long as they are kind to me and other people, right? when I'm talking to somebody, particularly about these games, like I'm just so excited to talk to somebody who understands what a saving throw is, who understands, what it means to have a character class and an ancestry, and what a role playing game is, and who Matt Colville is, and all that kind of stuff. And so that enthusiasm, I think, is infectious. And these games are fun. It's why we want to work on them. If we wanted to make lots of money, we'd go be bankers, right? Like, that's the thing about all these nerds who want to make these games. They're smart people who could go do a lot of different things and make money, but this is where the passion lies for them. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right that the community of people I've found myself with has so much to do with where I am today, and being fortunate enough to do this thing full time, because people like Rudy and Bonnie and Jeff Greiner and Mike Shea and Matt, right? Like Matt took a chance on me, right? Chris Perkins took a chance on me. Haeck, Joey Haeck, right? Like all of these people, I feel really, really fortunate that I get to work with them, and I feel really fortunate for the opportunities that they have given me. And so, yeah, I 100% agree with what you're saying about that aspect of it. That like the people are hugely important, and it's why getting involved in the community, right? Like that is a big piece of advice that I have, is like get involved in the community and do it for the genuine reason that like you want to meet other people who love this stuff, and you're going to find yourself working with great people and talking to great people and having amazing conversations. And then one of the best things that you get to do is play games with all of these people, right? You and I haven't played a game yet, but I'm going to get you one day. And so, yeah, exactly. So those are the kinds of things that make this community grow. And if you can do one thing, it's bring more people into the community, then you've done a great thing for this world, and you've introduced somebody to, you said it earlier, right? Like it's just nothing like it. And so the more people we can share that with, the better. Yeah, I love this game, and I'm glad that you love it too. And I'm glad that everybody listening hopefully loves these games.
All right, so this is it with the interview proper, but James did agree to stick around for a few more minutes to answer some questions asked by members of the Manifold Creator Collective. If you want to stick around for a few Q&A questions, keep listening. All right, we'll go back to rolling the interview now. Awesome. Fizzer asks, how do you learn when to say yes or no to new projects?
Oh, that is a good question, Fizzer. The way that I know when to say yes or no, right? It's a skill that took a while to develop. And there's two things. The first is there are going to be times when you are asked to work on a project and you get a gut feeling about it that you're like, uh-oh, this isn't going to be good. And it might be because of the way in which you were asked. It might be that the content you're like isn't for you. And often it's the right thing to say. I've always regretted saying yes when I have that pit in my stomach, and I've never regretted saying no, right? And that is like a sixth sense that you learn to have. And sometimes it's based on like, I've worked with this person before and I didn't have a good time, and so we're not going to work together. But sometimes it's just like, there's something about this that is off. Trust that feeling in your gut. You can always go work on your own thing, right? Like that's the one thing that I always fall back on, is like, if you find yourself not busy and you want to work on something, you can make it yourself, right? Like, and that's one of the great things about this. The other thing is knowing when you're overbooked, right? And so I find that saying no to those things that you get the pit in your stomach means that you are not often overbooked. But if you're like, whew, I just can't take on one more thing. If you find yourself thinking that, and then you get offered a project, the answer to that should probably be like, hey, I can't take this on right now. But if it's something you're interested in, right? Like if it's like, oh man, I would kill to work on that. If you can say to that person, hey, I'm not available now, but I will be X, right? I will be then. Often those people are willing to work with you because they're like, yeah, I do want to work with you. I want to work with Astus. I want to work with Fizzer. And so let people know when you are and aren't available. And every creator would much rather hear that you're not available rather than have you say you are and then fall down on the ball, right? So they'll come back to you. That's the other thing, is you need to tell yourself they'll come back to you, and you'll feel more okay saying no when you're overbooked.
So the next question, this one actually sparked quite a discussion for us in the group. How does feedback, and that's either from testers or colleagues, inform your design choices? Or this is probably the more specific question. Have you ever ignored feedback and it was the right move?
Yes, all the time. Oh man. Well, So the answer is, there's a hierarchy to these things, right? The person leading the project, if they give feedback, generally the answer is like, okay, I'm going to do it, right? And if you've got the time, you should try at least. When somebody leading a project says, I would like to see this, they're taking on a lot of work leading that project. They're the one leading the vision. And so the assumption is that, like, we'll let this person do this because honestly, they'll get your work and they could change it if they want to, right? So it helps to be a team player. Now, if we're talking about someone who's a co-equal or a collaborator or a tester, right? I think it's different. If they're a co-equal, right? Or even if there's somebody who you work with on the project and you have the time to like try out the thing, like play test the thing, I think you should go for it, right? It never hurts to try it because you might learn something else from it. If you don't have the time and you're like, I just know in my gut this isn't going to work, I do recommend talking to that person about why. Often, we will get feedback from testers, particularly from our testing team, right, which Fizzer is actually a part of. And we'll say, hey, here's why we can't do this, right? Or I'll explain, like, here's why this isn't going to work for us. Here's why this isn't, right? I want to educate people as to why we're not doing that. And then I'm going to go ahead and push forward and not do it. And often it's like, yeah, it's because I've already thought about it and therefore it wouldn't work. It's because maybe I've already tried it and it didn't work. Or sometimes it's like, you have a different vision for where this thing is going than I do, and I am in charge of the vision for this. And so it's always important to, like we said, you have that North Star. You have to be the one to stick to that North Star. And if somebody is taking you away from that, I think it's okay to ignore that feedback.
One thing, I'm not nearly as experienced with working with testers, but just over the years, something I learned about myself was I like to go into testing with really specific questions. I find that really helps me because you get questions when you're designing something like, is this monster too hard? Or is this a fun thing to interact with? Or would it be oppressive? And when questions like that pop 100%. Up, you can test specifically for those things rather than people weighing in on your artistic vision, right? So that's just a way for testing to actually be driven by what you as an artist think is cool rather than letting people dictate to you, because that just takes the fun out of it, right? Like we do all this work because we want to get our ideas out there, I think. Next question. When writing an adventure based on someone else's ideas, how should you keep, or how much should you keep to the original source material? Like, how important is that to you, that if you're writing in the Forgotten Realms, that you really connect to the Forgotten Realms themes and world and things like that?
Oh, that's a good question. So I think that if you're writing an adventure in a specific published setting, right, my question would be, if you don't want to stick to the themes of that setting, why are you setting it there? Why not set it somewhere else, right? Now, it might be that you're like, look, I just think Drizzt Do'Urden is really cool, and I want an adventure where you kill Drizzt Do'Urden, so it has to take place in the Forgotten Realms. Okay, fair, right? Like, I think that if you want to interact with a specific element of that IP and just that element, and you have a way to do that, I think that that's always fine. You want to create, like, a meme, basically, right? But if you're like, I just have an idea for a cool adventure, therefore I'm going to set it in the Forgotten Realms, or, hey, I'm going to set this in Eberron, but I'm not going to tie it to the fact that there was the last war and there's this pending other war that's going to come up, and, the sort of World War I, post-World War I themes of Eberron, then I would say, like, just set it anywhere. Set it in generic Fantasyland. Make it something that's easy to drop in because it's more likely to see use then. But I think it's also okay. Like, I wouldn't be mad, but I would say to that designer, okay, why do you want to set this adventure in Vesloria, for instance, when it could work in any Fantasyland, right?
So that question was asked by Fox Robin Hood, who's doing some really, really cool work in Roll20 with Draw Steel, by the way, guys. So if you want to import macros for all the monsters, Fox Robin Hood is the guy to go for that. You can contact me and I can set you up with that. But he kind of specifies that he wants to actually adapt Matt's books, Priest and Thief, as Draw Steel adventures. But I think he just wants to do that for his friends. But he feels like...
Oh, cool.
He doesn't want it to feel like players and directors who have read the books feel like it's a carbon copy of the books, right?
Oh yeah. Well, I think you can have themes, and you can have you can even have story beats that are similar, right? Without ripping off wholesale the story itself. Yeah, and absolutely, and it would still belong in the world of MCDM, right? Or in the world of Matt's novels, really.
One of the members of our group is interested in editing, and they're wondering, where do you find editors? Is it like, do you guys have editors on staff at MCDM, or do you work through an agency? And where would people find those jobs?
Great question. We don't do either of those things, actually. So we find editors the same way we find our freelance writers, which is that we look at products that we like, and then we reach out to the people whose names are in the credits of those products. So like, hey, did you work on you worked on this great book. Let's talk about it, because I think that the book itself came together really well. Let's reach out to that editor, right? So for us personally, all of our editors right now are freelance, although we do occasionally edit each other. Like I'm an experienced editor, Will is an experienced editor, so we will occasionally do in-house editing, but often we're the ones writing stuff, and it's a bad idea to edit the work that you write. When we were finding people for Arcadia, I looked at the DMs Guild, and I looked at Drive Through RPG, and I looked at third-party books that came out, and saw who was working on stuff and thought, like, these are the people to work with. Same thing with editors, right? We find editors that way too.
Yeah. Well, hopefully once the Manifold, or members of the Manifold, start releasing products, because we're all kind of building up for the release of Draw Steel, that, editors are going to start getting work in our community, and then if any of those products take off, then there you go, your name's in the credits. So
yes.
Well, I tried to weave in the others into the talk, and of course, everyone I'm sure at the Manifold knows, if you have questions for James, he's very generous with his time, doing mostly weekly streams where he answers questions. So, James, thank you so much. This has been a blast, and and it's gone way over time, so thank you for that.
Of course, Aestus, thank you. And really, again, I really do want to encourage people, if they do have questions, come talk to me on Twitch, find me on Blue Sky, and let's chat, because the more I can do to support Charles Steele creators, the better. And thank you to you for having this interview with me, and thank you to the MCC for being awesome and making stuff.
All right, folks, that's it for this one. Thank you so much for listening. If you want to listen to more interviews like this, subscribe. Also, I'm intending to release part 2 of my Avalo Adventure series, so keep an eye out for that. I'll catch you next time.